Hi, my name is Jillian Hartley, and I'm a person who has a background in heritage and history. And today I'm going to have a short conversation about Generation Z. What we're going to do is kind of look at the generations that preceded it, just a few of them, and look at how events influenced the generations, and kind of then examine Generation Z and some of the things that have happened in the late 1990s and early 2000s that have had a profound effect on that generation. Let me start off by saying in no way, shape, or form am I saying that people from generations are going to have the same opinions. I was born in the late 1970s. I certainly have friends who were born around the same time that I was, who have different political opinions and have different opinions about the economy. But when looking at generations, it's important to understand too that there are some events that take place that do have a profound influence on generations. And so we're going to kind of look at a few of those trends. And I think a good place to start would be with baby boomers. Of course, as most of you probably know, in 1945, World War II came to an end. And, the story goes that there were a lot of men who were anxious to come home and be with their wives. And there's this massive population boom that happens as a result from the late 1940s until about the mid 1960s. And so, known as the baby boom, there's some things about this generation that definitely did have a major impact on them. For example, this is the first generation that had televisions in the home, where it became somewhat common to have televisions in the home. So, from the previous generation, which had relied a lot on radio for communication, for things like news, what we find is by the 1950s, there's a lot of televisions that have TV shows and news that people have easy access to. And of course, a lot of those television shows sort of reinforce certain things about family and definitely reinforce stereotypes about, women and minorities. But it was a generation that was able to be entertained in that way for the first time. In addition to that, this is a generation whose parents basically got the United States through things like the Great Depression and World War II. And because of World War II, they do inherit the fruits of a lot of the industry and manufacturing that gave the United States such a major advantage after World War II. So during World War II, a lot of the countries that were involved in Europe, like Britain and Germany, that had massive industry, they had a lot of damage to that infrastructure. And so there's a need to supply the world during the 1950s with things, and the United States is this massive industrial power that's able to do that because, unlike a lot of countries, our industrial infrastructure was not damaged to any large extent during the war. And so the U.S. has this booming economy during the 50s, which allows for a lot more investment in the country, things like interstate highway systems. And so Americans begin to buy cars, they start traveling on the highways. It's also important to note that this is in the context of the Cold War. The United States during the 1950s and up and through the early 90s was in a Cold War with the Soviet Union. And so this is a time where a lot of children grew up fearing nuclear attacks. It's a time, too, where they were oftentimes motivated by the fact that there was sort of this enemy overseas that they were taught would try to, basically take away the American way of life. I want to mention something else, though, before we leave the baby boomers, and that is that not everyone had an opportunity at becoming, taking, or at least taking part in the American dream during the 1950s. You might notice that the image that I have on this particular slide is of Levittown. It's an example of a suburban plan that was put together, and it discriminated and it only allowed initially white people to purchase homes. There are a lot of things like redlining and practices that were discriminatory in regard to lending that made it to where a lot of the people who kind of grew into the middle class and took advantage of it were mostly white people. And so those are things that we still see ramifications for today, and definitely is something that I think this current generation, Generation Z, is well aware of, maybe even more so than previous generations. So the next one we're going to go over is Generation X, which is my generation, which is fitting that I have orange now on my face because Generation X really comes from about the mid-1960s until the late 1970s. Now, if you're one of those people who says, but I was born in, let's say, 1962, but I feel a lot more like a baby boomer than I do someone in Generation X, or vice versa. There's a word for that. It's, you're a cusper. You're basically on the cusp between generations. And so I want to mention that in case, you're one of those who maybe associates more with a generation that came before you versus one that's after you. You're on the cusp between generations. And quite frankly, there are a lot of people who sometimes have, some of each. There are certainly people who were born in the late 1970s who might actually associate more with people who are millennials when it comes to some of the trends and some of the way that they see the world. But typically, Generation X would look at the mid 1960s until the late 1970s until about 1980. This is a generation that had a lot to contend with. For one, this is a generation that witnessed at a very young age the Vietnam War. And even though this is a generation that was too young to send people to the Vietnam War, it's a generation that witnessed a lot of people going off to war. And unlike in wars like World War II, where a lot of the men came home to parades and things like that, a lot of the men who returned from Vietnam came home and there weren't big celebrations. They weren't being patted on the back and being offered jobs and things like that. And the fact, too, in Vietnam became very, very clear, especially by the late 60s and early 1970s, that the United States wasn't likely going to win, even though it was continuing to send troops overseas. It kind of created an air of distrust that was not necessarily the norm in the United States. Of course, another thing I have listed here is Watergate, because although it might seem kind of strange to some of the younger people watching this, there was a time that a lot of Americans had a lot of trust in their leaders, and the idea that a president would actually try to cover something up and lie seemed out of the norm. And so you see from this generation sort of a distrust of authority. And on top of that, it's a generation that had a lot less time with parents. I read a study one time that said the average Generation X parent spent about 14 minutes a day with their kids, and about half of that time was spent chastising the child for doing something wrong. This is a generation often called the latchkey generation because children went home a lot and stayed home alone. It's probably one of the reasons why this is a generation that's been watching and really enjoying the Netflix series Stranger Things, because they remember what it was like to come home and there's hardly any parents anywhere. But this is a generation that has had an easier time sort of questioning social norms and traditions because of the upbringing. And it's something that I certainly can relate to as far as my experiences. Divorce rates were higher during this generation, which meant a lot of people were in single-parent homes, which was absolutely nothing wrong with being a single parent. But it made it more difficult, especially for single mothers who are oftentimes getting paid less money and struggling. And in addition to that, this is a generation that was continuing in that Cold War. And of course, the Cold War goes through many different stages and phases, but it's still a generation that kind of feared communists, even though the fight against the communists in Vietnam had not gone well. This is also the first generation to actually have video games. And so this is a generation that found ways to try to entertain itself. And it's important to note, too, that this generation, many people in this generation were actually the children of baby boomers. And so while we have with baby boomers this really kind of, coddling, family is so important, let's focus on, traditions, things like that, there's definitely a backlash there. And Generation X might not have had as much family time. But I think it's fair to say that some of the people from Generation X who had children tried to make up for that with their own children. The next generation we're going to briefly go over is the Millennials, because so much of what has happened to the Millennials has been cause for concern for people in Generation Z. And again, I would love to hear from some of you who are in both the Millennial category and the Gen Z category. But where a lot of people in Generation X were raised without a lot of parental guidance, a lot of people who were raising kids in the millennial generation were from Generation X, and so they've been accused of being helicopter parents. But of course, when you start to look at, well, if my parents weren't home, they didn't seem to take much of an interest in me. They would just sort of sign my report cards. If I didn't get a grade they liked, they would, tell me about it and then tell me to move on. Millennials have been often perceived as being pampered because they've had so much oversight. But it is important to note things like, for example, how we know now that it takes a lot longer for people's minds to mature. And so some of the things that we did in previous generations, especially with Generation X, we might have had too much children might have been given too much responsibility from what they were actually capable of dealing with and coping with. Um, but this is a generation, from what we have seen, have actually been very keen on the idea of volunteering. Um, this is a generation, many of them do remember still what it was like before the internet and before things like cell phones were common. So a lot of millennials grew up without having such easy access to information. This is a generation, too, that did witness the fall of communism in the early 1990s. And of course, um, for a lot of people who are millennials, they were probably too young to remember it, but they definitely experienced that mass shift from when the United States went from being one of two superpowers to basically being the main world power. And the US really capitalized off of that during the age of globalization. You know, we've had globalization really since the Columbian era, but globalization in the 1990s after the fall of the Soviet Union, there's so much more interconnection there. And this is a generation that definitely witnessed an economy, for example, in the 1990s that really profited as a result, plus things like Silicon Valley. With that said, though, the millennial generation has been struggling due to things like the lack of wage growth. And there's less opportunities, especially when it comes to economic opportunities for millennials. And it might definitely be a factor, but we also know that millennials are not reproducing at the rate that previous generations have. And so, kind of keeping some of the experiences of those previous generations in mind, I do want to kind of get to know Generation Z a little bit better. And of course, some people call them iGen because we now have so many Apple products. There's a wonderful article that's on the reference page at the end, though. It was written by somebody who was a teenager in Generation Z, and he pointed out that he did not like being called iGen. And so if you're somebody who does not like that, I do apologize. But this is a generation where, whether they had access to it or not, the internet has pretty much always existed. Cell phones have always been very common. This is a generation that tends to really be driven by its emotions, the way that it feels about things. It's also one of the things that we look at with this generation, because there is so much learning that's now done online. You know, people really need internet access and computers to have access to all of the wealth of knowledge that's out there. And so therefore, you know, the digital divide is one that is very concerning and something to think about. Another thing, too, and this goes back to our discussion with millennials, is there's a lot of concern when it comes to economic issues. Now, social issues, though. Let's talk about some of the things that socially seem to be really driving Gen Z. And for one, this is a generation that has experienced so much social media. And I think one of the interesting things, and in my research, what I've noticed, and also talking to people from Generation Z, is that a lot of people from Generation Z tend to lean toward social media that has more anonymity. You know, for example, if you're somebody who's on Facebook, you might notice that, you know, if you're like me, you've got, you know, parents, grandparents on Facebook. Whereas I have a teenager who's a lot less active on Facebook. He prefers other social or other modes and mediums of social connection. And one of the things that we do kind of see is that it's because they like more anonymity. There's more of a desire to try to stay away from things like Facebook, where you have people who kind of have more political leanings and things like that. I had someone, a person from Generation Z tell me, it's just too negative. You know, I want something that is about, you know, my friends' experiences and them having fun, but I don't want all the negativity. This is also a generation that has older parents on average and fewer siblings. And things like terrorism and violence in schools has always been an issue. You know, of course, we've always had violence in schools, but what we have seen really over the last 15 to 20 years is there's been more mass shootings in schools. Bullying takes on many forms, and because there's so much emphasis on emotions, there's been a lot of ramifications from bullying in this particular generation. And that certainly probably has not helped the fact that this is a generation too that has seen a lot more um, children and teenagers diagnosed with things like anxiety disorders and depression. And of course, depression is something that, especially if somebody's diagnosed with clinical depression, that's a very, very serious thing. And so one of the things that I try to encourage people to do is, and I'll use myself as an example, being from Generation X, if I had been, in my late teens and I had gone to a parent, I dare say, and a teacher or somebody and said, I really feel depressed. There's actually a pretty decent possibility someone would have said, well, what do you have to be depressed about? And one thing to always keep in mind is that when people do struggle, one of the last things you probably want to say, and again, I'm not a clinical psychologist, but probably one of the last things you want to say is that you don't have any reason to feel the way you do. And so when dealing with people just in general, that's just something to remember. And just keep in mind that this is a generation that has had a lot more of that going on. Something I love about this generation too is they don't seem to be that trendy. They don't seem to be that into name brands the way that some previous generations have been, and certainly my generation was. I had a great conversation one time with a person from Gen Z, and I said, well, what is it without the trends? And she said, you know what, people should wear what they want to. They should wear what makes them feel comfortable, what makes them feel good. Who cares if it has a symbol on it? Or who cares if it doesn't fit what some fashion trend that's going on right now? And I just loved that answer so much. It's a generation that's very concerned about the environment, and it's concerned about the environment for a very good reason. For the last 200 years, the population of the planet has grown, I think, 7 times. And so there's a real concern about resources and how we've treated the planet. In addition, this is a generation that grew up watching things like SpongeBob SquarePants. And there's definitely been some research to suggest that led a lot of children asking, why are people throwing stuff in the ocean? Why is something falling down on Squidward's house? Another interesting thing, too, is that there seems to be less concern with the pomp and circumstance of being a teen. And I think that's been a very, very interesting trend. And again, that's something that I would really love to hear more from people from Generation Z. The idea, how important is prom? How important is it to go through some of those, what were kind of considered to be teenage milestones, and is it as important as other things? Because a lot of the research shows with this generation, it's maybe not quite so much. In addition to that, there's a lot of people from Generation Z who've waited a lot longer to try to drive. Financial considerations are a really big one for Generation Z, and for one, we're living at a time where the wealth gap is the largest that it's been since the 1920s, which is definitely a concern for this generation and should be a concern probably for everybody. And they have been somewhat discouraged by the lack of millennial progress. And this is a reason why we've seen some people from Gen Z being a little bit more cautious in how they spend their money for training in college after high school. We've seen a lot of enrollment increases in community colleges where things are a whole lot cheaper. And it could also be because of the return on educational investment. You have to realize if you're somebody who's in Generation Z, and again, please feel free to weigh in if you are, if you remember a person who graduated 10 years before you, who was a valedictorian, was going to do all these great things, that person went to college, graduated with a degree, everything seems great. But that person's had a hard time making it financially because of stagnant wages and salaries. That can be very discouraging. And so that worry, on top with worrying about finding a job where they can support themselves, that's just something to be aware of, and rather than possibly say to the person who just graduated from college in the early 20s, well, it's time to start saving for a house, you better start saving for a down payment. You might consider whether this is a person who has a really high student loan, is having a hard time even making a vehicle payment and paying electric bills. Tell somebody like that, well, you better start saving. It may be one of those issues where they may not be able to. I will say too, and this is part of what encouraged me to do my own YouTube channel. A lot of this generation is learning from things like YouTube videos. This is a means where you can have both, written, audio, and visual stimulation in the learning process. And so, a lot of the skills that are being developed by this generation are not necessarily being done in a traditional classroom. Another thing, too, is that emotions and feelings are very, very important to this generation. Wanting fulfillment, wanting to be able to contribute in order to make those connections. In the learning environment and in the workplace, and we have seen some things that it might be advantageous for people to know about. With this generation, you have a generation of people who have been on a computer, who've had a television going on, and possibly a phone down here. And so a lot of the research shows that there are declining attention spans because of digital devices. We have people who are just sort of going from one to the next. They are craving stimulation, wanting challenges, and that is something to consider. If you're working with somebody and, clearly that person seems to be getting bored, there's some kind of task that needs to be done, you might consider drawing that person in, saying, what do you think? What would you do? Engaging this generation is a very, very good idea. And the reason why it's a good idea is because, for one, having a declining attention span doesn't necessarily mean that a person can't get anything done. Instead, what it could mean is that a person's a really good multitasker. If I can work over here and do this over here, kind of go back and forth, that might not be something that a person from a previous generation can relate to. But it can allow for the sorting through a vast amount of information in what might eventually be a shorter period of time in comparison to a different type of approach. Another thing, too, is that there's a lot of empathy, and then, of course, that kind of goes back to the emotional, aspects and being driven by emotions. But there's this Generation Z seems to be extremely open-minded, very strong sense of empathy. And a lot of the research shows, too, they like to work independently rather than in group settings. And I think when you're looking at people who really want to challenge, who really want to make their way and they want to make a difference, as somebody who prefers working independently, I get it. I want to forge, through. I want to make my mark, and sometimes working with a big group of people, there are people who feel like that kind of slows them down. And the other thing, too, is that learning is always happening. With the Generation Z, this is a generation that has constantly things going on. And, a friend of mine told me last year, she has a teenage daughter, and she said that one day my friend, sat down on the couch and was just sort of sitting there resting, and she wasn't watching the TV, she didn't have her phone in her hand or anything like that. But her daughter came up to her and she said, "Mom, what are you doing?" And she said, "I'm just sitting here." But her daughter said, "Well, what are you doing now?" And she said, "I'm just sitting here." And so, one of the things that we've seen because of constant stimulation, especially with devices, is there may always be that tendency to want to be doing something. Some final thoughts here, and these are just some basic things for people who might be interacting. And again, this isn't just with Generation Z, it's probably good practice all the time. But one, be prepared to explain the importance of polite technology. As somebody who has been in the capacity to be, monitoring people, I've oftentimes had to say, please make sure your phones are turned off, and please, don't just answer your phone and start talking. I think that that's an important thing or explaining it's important because some people may not know. They may actually not know. And so where there was an assumption sometimes like you should just behave, and if you don't, there's going to be some big penalty. Sometimes you just need to take the time to explain why something might not be kosher. Another thing, too, is that we have seen in previous generations, and especially the baby boomers, there's a sense of punching a clock and putting your time in. With Generation Z, there does tend to be sort of a leniency towards more task-oriented things. Um, and therefore, we've definitely seen some companies that have gone more towards this approach of the task-oriented. Here you go, get this done and work on it, versus, punch a clock at 8, leave at 5. You may have somebody who's been there all day long who's accomplished very little. Sometimes giving people specific tasks to work on, letting them work at their own pace, you can actually get greater productivity. Just something to think about, letting people work at their own pace. It's important to be spontaneous. This is a generation that really has had a lot of stimulation in a lot of different ways and has been able to find it in ways that previous generations couldn't growing up. And so sometimes trying to be spontaneous and trying to kind of change things up can really keep people going and keep morale up. You don't want to be too homogenized with anything. Another thing too is if you're, in a work setting, or if you're in, a classroom or something like that, and you have people on their phones already, feel free to tell them to look stuff up. For example, if somebody's teaching history and a person says, well, gosh, these people seem to be on their phones, but you know what, we're talking about the progressive era, we're talking about conservation, and I'm just going to say, you know what, there was an act that was passed in 1902 that was a really important act, and I want you all to look it up, and I want to know who can tell me what it was called first, and put people in a position where they can actually use those devices, because I can tell you, they're not going anywhere, okay? The phones are probably not going to go anywhere. Variety is very important. Detailed directions are very important, because there is so much going on. Don't assume because you give someone some vague directive that they're going to be able to understand everything that you want out of that. And be prepared to give those sort of details. In addition to that, this is a generation that has had experiences that have led to some wounding. And that's obvious by the increased diagnoses of anxiety and depression. For that reason, I really encourage people to always provide consistent and frequent feedback. And this is something that we should probably do for everyone. But it's very important for people who are putting in a lot of hard work to know what they're doing well and to be told often how they're doing. And that can really help build a person and also help build confidence, which is a great thing. And of course, in our day and age too, it's very important to make sure that we're trying to be as accurate as possible. And we need to try to teach, especially Gen Z with such access to information, that it is important to find accurate information. And always try to stay positive. So we've covered a lot in this video, and I look forward to seeing some of the conversations that come as a result of that. In the process of doing research for this video, I actually came across a number of really great articles and books. And so what I'm going to leave you all with is this reference page that has them on it, just in case you want to do further research on your own. Bye now.